The UK Equalities and Human Rights Commission has released new interim guidance to businesses, associations and public institutions on how single-sex spaces should be managed and operated. The new advice follows on from the Supreme Court ruling that woman in the Equality Act can only mean someone born a biological female. This is from the interim guidance. It says, in workplaces and services that are open to the public, trans women, so biological men, their words, should not be permitted to use the women's facilities, and trans men, in brackets, biological women, should not be permitted to use the men's facilities. In some circumstances, the law also allows trans women, biological men, in brackets, not to be permitted to use the men's facilities, and trans men, biological women, to not be permitted to use the women's facilities. So that's, you can use neither toilet. And they say, however, where facilities are available to both men and women, trans people should not be put in a position where there are no facilities for them to use. It's very nice of the EHRC to at least give them that. Where possible, mixed-sex toilet, washing or changing facilities, in addition to sufficient single-sex facilities, should be provided. So this is the really, we showed you last Friday, Maya Forstatter, who'd sort of suggested, when someone had sort of said, well, what about, you don't want trans women in female toilets, or what about if you have trans men now in female toilets? And she said, well, she sort of implied, it's their choice to become trans men. If they've made themselves look like men, then they can't necessarily come to the women's toilet, even if they also can't go to the men's toilet, which seemed extreme. Well, it was extreme when she says it, but now it's what the EHRC is saying. Obviously, very concerning. Seems unworkable to me. We'll talk about that in a moment. They also have advice on clubs and associations. A woman-only or lesbian-only association should not admit trans women, biological men, and a men-only or gay men-only association should not admit trans men, biological women. Now, this to me seems like kind of the most overreach, because this is about voluntary associations, right? So this is any group over, if I've got this right, any group which is more than 25 people. So if you make kind of like a queer female or queer women tango class, right? And the organizers, everyone there is very trans inclusive. You have a bunch of trans members. Now the EHRC is saying by law, the trans women must be expelled unless you say this is just a mixed sex, anyone can join association, which it just seems very overbearing. Like, why does the EHRC have to tell you whether you're allowed to be trans inclusive or not in your club? It's sort of this started, I always thought it was a bit weird. I could never see any example of it actually having been done, but there was the trans exclusionary sort of lesbian group saying, we're being forced to accept trans women into our lesbian groups. I didn't see any evidence that there really were trans women wanting to join their lesbian groups. But I can see their argument, which is that we aren't trans inclusionary and we'd like it to stay that way. Fine. But making everyone else be sort of opposed to trans people or not see trans women as women, it seems like you're forcing people to think a certain way. As I say, it seems extreme stuff. It's inevitably caused a big backlash, including from Hollywood actor Pedro Pascal, although not specifically to the HLC guidance, but sort of to this story in general. He replied to a video criticizing J.K. Rowling by saying the following: awful, disgusting shit is exactly right. Heinous loser behavior. The behavior in question included J.K. Rowling's support for gender-critical or trans-hostile campaigns, which culminated in this post after the Supreme Court ruling. With a caption, "I love it when a plan comes together." She posted a photo of herself smoking a cigar on her multi-million-pound super yacht. Ash, on this story, I think this is more about two celebrities disagreeing. Obviously, we're going to talk about the HRC sort of guidance as well. But why I think it's interesting to link it to this J.K. Rowling, Pedro Pascal sort of exchange is because one of the reasons he seems to feel so strongly about this is because he has a trans sister. He takes her on sort of many red carpets. And that's obviously, not many people are Hollywood actors, but lots of people do have a trans friend or a trans sibling or a friend of a friend who is trans, or a daughter or a son who has a trans friend. Do you know what I mean? There are lots of trans people, which means that having a policy which is so exclusionary to trans people and so hostile, it does seem like I'm not sure it's going to be able to hold. Owen Jones was saying over the weekend it could be a victory they never recover from, because they've almost the trans exclusionary people, the trans hostile people, they've almost won their most extreme position, which seems like it's inevitably going to lead to a big backlash. Even if that's not to say in the immediate term this is just going to be incredibly stressful and horrible for trans people. But is there a chance that they've gone so far that the backlash is going to be sort of so big that it's difficult for this position to be maintained?
Can I tell you a little story? And I'm going to
Please
tell you a
do.
little story about someone who I know you've got a lot of affection for, Michael, which is my mum. So when I was in my early 20s, I remember talking to my mum a little bit about trans issues. And I think that you could have described her views, I think she wouldn't have used the word gender critical to describe herself, but that's kind of what she thought. She was a bit worried that, talking about transgender youth was sexualizing children. She was worried about predatory men in women's spaces, all that kind of thing. And one of the things that is most important to her, still is the most important to her, is always about child protection, because she spent her career as a social worker working in child protection. And then some years went past. We didn't really talk about the issue very much. And then one day she was talking to me about a complaint had been put in by some gender critical feminists about a trans inclusive exhibition at an art gallery. And so, my mum had to go down and deal with it and be like, no, this doesn't pose a threat to children. And what was so interesting to me was that when we were having this conversation, her point of view when it came to trans inclusivity had totally transformed the other way. And so instead, she was approaching it as, well, look, if you take children's safeguarding seriously, if you take well-being and protection from male violence seriously, that leads you to a more trans-inclusive position. And I think that that was really important because it demonstrated two things. One is that if you give people the opportunity to learn through contact with actual trans people, their ability to shift is immense, because our capacity for empathy is almost always greater in practice than it is in theory. So you might have a really hardline position in theory, but then in practice, when you're confronted by the humanity of someone, you change. And the second thing, which I think is really important, particularly for my mum, is that she had no social media during those years. So she wasn't on Mumsnet, she wasn't on Facebook, she wasn't on Twitter. She wasn't involved in this sort of opinionating where you take a very trans hostile position and you make it the be all and end all of your social media self, which is something which happens with gender critical feminists online. It's something that I've noticed. It's not just one position amongst many, like it turns into a real fixation and an obsession. And I think that you've seen this with J.K. Rowling. So to take it back to the Pedro, Pascal and J.K. Rowling thing, she appears to have made it, her biggest public contribution. Personally, I think if I was a billionaire, there are much more socially useful things I would want to do with that money, particularly things which would materially support vulnerable women. I don't think that picking on trans people makes cisgender women all that safer, but hey. So I think that that's an example of, not just how people can come to more trans inclusive positions because they're directly related to a trans person like Pedro Pascal is, but just through living life, doing your job, being brought into contact with more kinds of people. I think that empathy is the most natural response. And it takes a system of demonizing, a system of institutional takeover, a system of moral panic, a system of relentlessly negative coverage to turn actual human beings into, boogeymen and scare figures. And I think that that's what's happened when it comes to trans people in this country.
I think very well put. We're going to sort of race through some of the more political responses to this from the major parties who have all responded to the EHRC guidance over the weekend. Labour, as you'll probably have seen already, they've welcomed the Supreme Court guidance. And speaking on the Laura Kuenssberg show, Cabinet Secretary Pat McFadden was asked if trans employees in Whitehall would be stopped from using the toilets and changing rooms they usually use.
Yes, that's the logical consequence of the judgment and the guidance that's come out, that people use the facilities of their biological sex. That's what the court said, and that's what the guidance has said.
So that is what the government will ban trans people from using the facilities that they want to choose.
We will react. But look, in reality, when you say ban, am I going to be standing outside toilets? I'm probably not. There isn't going to be toilet police, but that is the logical consequence of the court ruling and the EHRC guidance.
It's a really mealy-mouthed response, because what Labour have wanted to do this whole time is basically say the law has nothing to do with us, even though we're the people who can change the law, right? They also can, they can reject the guidance given by the EHRC, but they get to say, oh, this is what someone else has said. And also we're going to kind of play the nice guys because we're not going to enforce it where we work. And so you've basically told every sort of organisation in the country that the legal guidance is this. And so you've got all these organisations thinking, well, if I don't enforce the legal guidance, then I'm going to be subject to being sued in court by a gender-critical activist, for example. But they're saying, well, that's the conclusion of it, but we're not necessarily going to follow it ourselves. It's a bit like a politician saying, oh, yeah, so the speed limit is 20 miles, but I mean, who really checks? It's either it's a stupid law or it's not, right? And I think the fact that Pat McFadden says he's not going to enforce this means that he kind of believes on one level it's a stupid law, but he's too, I suppose, cowardly to say that. Ed Davey, I'm not going to show you him, but he was more sceptical of the EHRC guidance. Who I am going to show you is Greens leader Carla Denyer.
We're really worried that the guidance from the EHRC has been rushed, clearly. It's been ill thought out, in my opinion, and it's really obvious that they have not listened to trans people, possibly not consulted them at all in the preparation of this guidance. Well, I think it's quite clear that it will create the risk of discrimination, direct and indirect, against trans people, especially in workplaces. I think it has the potential to create some unintended consequences, as Ed Davey was saying. I think it hasn't considered the consequences of what happens if you say to trans people that they are not allowed to go to the toilet in their gender or in their birth sex. Well, and almost as an afterthought, the guidance says, but they shouldn't be left with nowhere to go. But there's no suggestion of how that's going to be resolved.
So what do you want to see happen then?
Well, it is obviously early days. It only came out on Friday night. I have already been and will continue to be liaising closely with human rights and LGBT organisations to get their expert advice. But I won't hesitate to push for changes in legislation if it becomes apparent that that's necessary. And now I'm not a legal expert, but I think it may be necessary because it does seem to leave some big gaps. And it seems to fly in the face of the strong tradition of tolerance we have in Britain. For example, the EHRC guidance seems to be saying that if a lesbian association or venue wants to be inclusive, wants to include trans women, and let's bear in mind that lesbian women, non-trans lesbian women are amongst the most supportive of trans people in the whole of society. So quite a lot of lesbian LGBT organisations are going to want to include trans people. The advice, seems to say that they won't be allowed to.
So would you like the guidance to be withdrawn and then we'll...
Yes, exactly. The Greens are calling for the guidance to be withdrawn. It's clearly rushed and ill thought out and they haven't consulted all the people who'd be affected. Okay. We're saying withdraw it, think again, consult everyone who'd be affected by this guidance and then come out with something more thought out.
I
Okay.
think that was really well put. And I mean, it's the point about how lesbians are proportionately a lot more trans inclusive than people who aren't part of the LGBT community is always missed. Even the Supreme Court ruling, they said, having trans inclusivity very terrible for lesbians. And obviously there are some campaigning lesbians who are very sort of trans exclusionary, and they see that as essential to their identity. Fine, but there's now this sort of impression in the press that lesbians are this particularly anti-trans group, which is just not true. And I think that's another place where this guidance is. It's almost like you're making guidance knowing that lots of people are going to ignore it, which always seems a bit like I don't know whether or not that can hold. I mean, hopefully it doesn't hold. At the complete opposite end of the spectrum to the Greens was Kemi Badenoch.
It's not as complex a situation as is often made out to be. We managed to deal with this a very long time without issues. The thing that has created the biggest problem isn't trans people. It is predatory men who used lax rules to say, actually, I'm a woman now, and go into women's loos. Yeah. And I've had letters from women who've been assaulted in their toilets.
I understand that, but can I just,
but we mustn't forget that. We mustn't forget
you're very good about talking about the issues, but not talking specifically about what you would do. Would you say trans people now need their own facilities?
Most, if not all organizations have a way of dealing with this. Not having gender-neutral loos is one of the easiest things that you can do. Almost all businesses I see have disabled loos. They are unisex, different from gender neutral. Trans people can use those. But if you are providing a single sex space, it has to be a single sex space. And the Supreme Court has said, as I always had, that sex is biological. It is biological.
Okay.
It is not something that you just act.
One final question.
So it's a strange intervention because on the one hand, she says trans people aren't the problem. It's just that there's too lax rules. And so men who aren't trans are exploiting this. Well, then that might make sense in the self-ID debate. And I was a bit more sympathetic in the self-ID debate, I have to say. But when it comes to women or trans women who've been women for decades, taken loads of hormones, have a GRC, then she's saying, well, they're not the problem. Well, if they're not the problem, why are you also excluding them from the toilets as well?
So the first thing to point out is you may recall when the Supreme Court judgment came out, you had Lord Sumption, who's obviously a very well-regarded figure when it comes to, commenting on UK legal matters, very senior judge in his time. He said, well, look, the point about this judgment isn't to compel any organisation or institution to have single-sex spaces defined in this way. What he said was, when he was commenting on the judgment, was that you could have a women's football team which chooses to be trans-inclusive, but that you wouldn't be able to, say, bring legal action against a women's football team that didn't want to include trans women. That's what he said. So this is where the EHRC comes in, is that it appears to have gone further than the ruling in issuing this guidance to say, well, this is what it's going to mean socially. Now, why is it that the EHRC has done this? The reason why I think it has done this is because it is and always has been a Blairite quango. It has never been a vehicle for actual liberation of minority groups. That's not what it was designed to do. I think it was actually designed to co-opt and diffuse anti-racist movements and then latterly, LGBT movements as well. It has always been stacked with political appointees. So the EHRC obviously carried out that huge investigation into Labour anti-Semitism. Time and time again, it's refused to do an investigation into Tory party Islamophobia. I mean, its investigation into the Tory party regarding the Windrush deportations really could fit on the back of a cigarette packet. But the one for Labour anti-Semitism was enormous and a massive media story. And what appears to have happened, and there are news organisations who have paid attention to this over the last few years, is increasingly it's been stacked with people who would identify themselves as being on the more gender critical side. So that's why they've come out with this guidance, which seems to be not only far beyond the scope of the Supreme Court judgment, but also far beyond what most people think of as a common sense way of organising who goes where when it comes to, single sex or single gender facilities. It's because this is what they've been planning to do for ages. Gender critical feminists, and I hate that phrase because they're not actually critical of gender, I would say trans hostile feminists, they understood Gramsci's long march through the institutions and this project of defining women in a particular way, and then using that as a way to police who goes in what spaces. This has been years and years in the making.
Ash, we're doing lots of plugs this evening. If I Speak live, it's coming up. Do you know the date off by heart, or do you want me to tell you the date?
I do know the date off by heart.
Okay, you give us all the details.
All right, I actually don't know how much the Novara live audience is into If I Speak, because we've kept this very separate. It was mine and Moya's disgusting little brainchild. What we decided we wanted to do, in part so we could bring Novara to new audiences, is that we developed a kind of gossipy lifestyle relationships advice podcast. It's called If I Speak, after the amazing Jose Mourinho meme. I prefer not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble. It's developed quite a loyal following now. Really, really proud of that. And we are doing a live event. So me, Moya, in the flesh on the 21st of May at Earth Dalston. Hopefully we will have a very special guest. We're just doing some wrangling with agents and representatives now. And we're so, so excited to see our audience in person. So if you're interested, get your hands on tickets. They're going really, really fast. And we do have plans to take the show outside of London as well, but we want to see how this one goes first, and then we can troubleshoot it. So by the time we exit the M25, it's going to be a perfect product for all of you.
You don't need a special guest, Ash. You and Moira are more than special enough already. That's me trying to get some goodwill